The ghost of Jack Riley lived in the corpse of his grandfather's farm. He rattled around the skeletal farmhouse, a place where memories rotted in the walls alongside the mice and damp. Each morning, the November wind would bite through the cracked window panes. A familiar cold that did little to stir the deeper frost settled within his bones. He was a monument to ruin, a former Marine raider medically discharged into a world he no longer recognized, haunted by the ghosts of men who had died in a sun-scorched country half a world away. His days were a ritual of emptiness. He'd wake on a thin mattress on the floor, the cold concrete a constant, grounding reminder of his penance. His body, a roadmap of scars etched by shrapnel and surgery, ached with a dull, persistent throb. The leg was the worst. The IED that had stolen his team had left him with a network of titanium and nerve damage that sang arias of pain with every drop in barometric pressure. He'd limp to the rusted sink, splash water on a face that looked like a stranger's, and stare into eyes that held nothing but the flat, dead reflection of a man who had outlived his purpose. He had come back here, to this forgotten patch of West Virginia, because there was nowhere else to go. The money from the military was a pittance, gone in a haze of cheap whiskey and cheaper motels until all that was left was this crumbling inheritance. The fields were fallow, choked with weeds. The barn sagged, its spine broken, a great beast that had finally surrendered to gravity and time. It was a graveyard of failures, and he was its sole, silent caretaker. Sometimes the silence was worse than the screaming. In the quiet, the memories had room to move. The flash, the searing heat, the sudden violent pressure that felt like the world turning inside out. The sound of Sergeant Ramirez's laughter cut off mid-sentence. The weight of his brothers, gone in an instant, pressed down on him, heavier than any rucksack. He was the one who had walked out, or rather, been dragged out. Survivor's guilt was a hollow point round that tore through you slowly, day by day. He didn't speak to anyone. The nearest town was a 15-minute drive he rarely made. The people there looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. They saw the scars, the limp, the 1,000-yard stare that never quite focused on them. They saw a broken warrior, a dangerous thing. They were not wrong. The part of him that knew how to kill was the only part that still felt truly alive, a predator sleeping fitfully inside a cage of trauma and regret. He was cleaning his rifle for the third time that week, the familiar scent of solvent and oil a form of meditation, when he first heard it. It was a sound so out of place in the symphony of wind and creaking wood that it barely registered. A whimper, thin, desperate, and quickly devoured by a gust of wind that rattled the loose siding of the house. He froze, his hands still. He told himself it was the wind, a branch, an animal caught in a trap. He had no business with the suffering of others. He had enough of his own. He went back to methodically swabbing the barrel, the rhythmic motion of familiar comfort. But the sound came again, higher this time, a raw needle of pain piercing the gray afternoon. It was a sound he knew. It was the sound of something broken and alone, crying out into a world that did not care. It was a sound he had made himself, silently, in the dark, for years. With a curse that was more a prayer of exhaustion, he set the rifle down. He pulled on his worn boots, the leather stiff and cold, and grabbed a threadbare jacket from a hook by the door. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to bolt the door, and let the world handle its own misery. Involvement was a currency he could no longer afford to spend, but the whimper had hooked into him, a tiny barb in his soul that he couldn't ignore. He stepped out into the biting wind. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low. The sound had come from the direction of the old property line, near the woods that bordered his land. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his limp more pronounced in the cold, but his steps still unnervingly silent. He was a ghost moving through his own haunted grounds. He found the source 50 yards from the tree line, huddled against the rotted base of a fence post. It was a German shepherd, or what was left of one. The dog was a skeleton draped in matted fur, its ribs a washboard of suffering. One of its back legs was bent at an unnatural angle, swollen and caked with dried mud and blood. Its coat was patchy, its skin raw and red in places. But it was the eyes that stopped him. Sunken in their sockets, they glowed with a feverish, intelligent light. They were filled with pain, yes, but also a defiant spark of spirit that refused to be extinguished. As he approached, a low growl rumbled in the dog's chest, a sound that cost it a visible effort. It tried to push itself up, to stand and face the threat, but its broken body betrayed it. It collapsed back to the ground with another pained whimper. Jack stopped. He held up his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of non-aggression he'd used 100 times, in places where the wrong move meant a bullet. He saw the tremor in the animal's frame, the desperate will to fight against the overwhelming agony. He saw the pride in the face of utter defeat. He saw himself. In the depths of those amber eyes, he saw a mirror of his own brokenness, his own pain, his own stubborn refusal to completely surrender. "Easy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's growl subsided, replaced by a ragged, shallow panting. Its eyes never left his, tracking his every move. He could see the faint, faded lines of a tattoo inside its ear, mostly obscured by dirt and grime. It was a professional mark. This was not some stray. This was a soldier, just like him. A veteran discarded and left to die. Righteous anger, an emotion he hadn't felt with such clarity in years, surged through him. It was a clean, hot fire that burned away the fog of apathy. Someone had done this. Someone had taken this magnificent creature and shattered it, then thrown it away like garbage. He crouched down slowly, wincing as his own damaged leg protested. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. He spoke in a low, calm monotone, the same voice he used to use to soothe a jittery private on his first patrol. "It's okay. You're okay. We're going to get you out of here." The dog watched him, its head cocked. It didn't have the strength to fight or the will to run. It had made its last stand here, against this fence post, against the world. Jack reached out a hand, not to touch, but to show it was empty. The dog's nose twitched, sampling his scent. It smelled the cordite and the grief on him, the scent of a fellow combatant. After a long moment, the dog let out a soft sigh, a sound of profound weariness, and rested its head back on the frozen earth. Trust wasn't the right word. It was resignation, an acknowledgement of a shared fate. Jack knew what he had to do. This was a mission, his first in a long time. Objective: save this soldier. He followed the faint drag marks in the frosted grass, a clear trail leading away from the dog and back toward the road. The tracks were a story of a desperate crawl, a final agonizing effort to find safety that had ended in failure. But there were other tracks too. Boot prints, heavy, careless, and fresh. They led to a dirt track that cut through the woods. A path he knew led to a cluster of dilapidated trailers about a mile away, a place known for cheap drugs and casual cruelty. He went back to the dog. "I'll be back," he promised, the words feeling strange and important in his mouth. "I'm not leaving you." He moved through the woods like a wraith, his limp forgotten, his senses screamingly alive. The apathy that had been his shield for years had crumbled, replaced by a cold, focused rage. He was no longer Jack Riley, the ghost of the farm. He was Sergeant Riley of the Marine Raiders, and he was on the hunt. The trailer was even worse up close. A rusted single-wide festering in a clearing of junked cars and overflowing trash barrels. A mangy-looking pit bull was chained to a tire rim, barking mechanically. From inside, loud music thumped, a bass line vibrating through the ground. Jack didn't knock. He put his shoulder to the flimsy door, and it burst inward with a splintering crack. The music stopped. Two men were inside, sitting on a stained couch amidst a haze of chemical smoke. One was wiry and tweaked out. The other was big, with a greasy red beard and the dead, flat eyes of a pig. This was the one who wore the heavy boots. This was Red. "What the hell?" the wiry one yelped, scrambling backward. Jack ignored him. His eyes locked on Red. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The violence in his posture was a palpable force in the small, filthy room. "The shepherd," he said, his voice a low growl. "You beat it, you broke its leg, then you dumped it." Red pushed himself slowly to his feet, trying to use his bulk for intimidation. He was bigger than Jack, but it was the difference between a farm bull and a wolf. "That ain't your business. That was my dog, my property. did what I wanted with it. It's my business now, Jack said. He took a single step into the trailer. The floorboards groaned. The space seemed to shrink around him. He wasn't armed, not with a weapon, but every part of him was a weapon. His hands, his feet, the cold fury that had been honed in a dozen kill or be killed situations. Get out of my house, Red blustered, but there was a tremor of fear in his voice now. He glanced toward a baseball bat leaning against the wall. Don't, Jack said, his voice dropping even lower. It was not a request. It was a command that bypassed the ear and went straight to the brainstem. It was the voice of a man who had given orders that resulted in life and death. Red's hand froze. The dog was useless, Red spat, trying to regain some semblance of control. Wouldn't fight, just stood there. So I got rid of it. Jack saw it all in a flash. The dog, trained for loyalty and duty, refusing to engage in the pointless savagery of a dogfighting pit. Its spirit was too strong, its honor too ingrained. It had chosen a beating over betraying its nature. You're going to stay away from my land, Jack said, the words precise, each one a carefully placed blow. You're going to stay away from that dog. If I ever see you again, if I even hear that you've looked in my direction, I will come back here, and we will have a very different conversation. He held Red's gaze for a long 10 seconds, letting the man see the abyss behind his eyes. He saw the moment the bully's bravado crumbled into dust, replaced by primal fear. Red gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Jack turned and walked out without a backward glance. He didn't need to look back. He had established dominance. The predator had been put back in its cage. He returned to the wounded shepherd, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. He gently scooped the dog into his arms. It weighed almost nothing. The animal let out a small cry of pain, but didn't struggle. It seemed to understand. It rested its head against his chest, a gesture of surrender to this strange, dangerous man who had appeared out of the gray mist. Carrying the dog back to the farmhouse was an ordeal. Every step sent a jolt of sympathetic pain up Jack's own bad leg. But the weight in his arms was a strange comfort. It was a burden, yes, but it was a meaningful one. For the first time in years, he was responsible for something other than his own misery. He laid the shepherd on a pile of old blankets near the hearth, the only spot in the house that wasn't actively cold. He built a fire, the first one in months, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, pushing back the gloom. He carefully, painstakingly, cleaned the dog's wounds with warm water and the antiseptic from his old field kit. As he worked, he spoke, his voice a continuous, low murmur. He told the dog about the farm, about his grandfather, about the way the sun used to look coming over the ridges in the morning. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't need to. The dog already knew. While cleaning the filth from its ear, he saw the tattoo clearly. It was faded but unmistakable. A stylized skull wearing a Raider Stetson, and beneath it, the letters 3rd Mar B, and a series of numbers. 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, his unit. A jolt went through him, cold and sharp. This wasn't just any dog, this was one of theirs. A brother in arms, discarded and forgotten. The anger he'd felt before was nothing compared to the cold fury that settled in his gut now. This wasn't just cruelty, it was sacrilege. He had to know more. He finished cleaning the dog, splinted its leg as best he could with a couple of paint stirs and strips of torn t-shirt, and made a decision. He was going into town. The trip to the vet was tense. He laid the dog on the passenger seat of his beat-up truck, wrapped in every blanket he owned. The animal was surprisingly calm, its amber eyes watching him with an unnerving intelligence. It seemed to understand that this was a necessary evil. Dr. Anya Sharma's clinic was a small, cinder-block building at the edge of town, smelling of bleach and quiet desperation. She was a woman in her late 30s, with tired, kind eyes and hands that were never still. She looked at Jack, then at the broken dog in his arms, and her expression tightened. She'd seen men like Jack before, men with violence simmering just beneath the surface. She assumed the worst. What happened to him? She asked, her tone clipped and professional, already preparing for a story of abuse. I found him like this, Jack said, his voice flat. On my property. The leg is broken. He's been starved. Anya's gaze softened slightly, but she remained wary. She led him to an examination room and skillfully, gently, lifted the dog onto the stainless steel table. The dog flinched but didn't snap, its eyes darting to Jack for reassurance. He's severely dehydrated and malnourished. The leg is a bad break, a spiral fracture. Looks like it was caused by a sharp, twisting impact, she said, her fingers probing gently. Someone did this deliberately. Her eyes flicked to Jack, a question hanging in the air. I know, Jack said. I found him near a place where they fight dogs. He wouldn't fight. Anya looked at the shepherd on the table, at its noble head and the quiet dignity with which it bore its pain. Then she looked back at Jack, at the fierce, protective anger in his eyes. Her initial assessment of him began to shift. He has a tattoo, Jack said, pointing. And a microchip, I think. Can you scan him? Anya nodded, her curiosity piqued. She cleaned the ear again, studying the military insignia with a frown. That's a Marine Corps tattoo, for a working dog. She retrieved a handheld scanner and ran it over the dog's shoulders. It beeped. Got one, she said, looking at the small screen. ID number and a name. She paused. His name is Kaiser. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Kaiser. It was a strong name, a warrior's name. There's more, Anya said, her brow furrowed. There's a flag on the file, Department of Defense. Most of the information is encrypted. This isn't a standard registration. This is a military asset. She looked up at him, the pieces clicking into place. The scars on his face, his bearing, the way he stood guard over the animal. You were in, weren't you? Marines, he confirmed, his voice tight. Third raters. Her expression changed completely, from suspicion to a deep, weary empathy. Then you know what this means. This dog shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be anywhere but on a base or with a handler. He was dumped, Jack said, the words like stones in his mouth. Left to die. Anya worked for the next hour, her initial wariness replaced by a focused compassion. She set Kaiser's leg properly in a cast, administered fluids and antibiotics, and gave him a shot for the pain. The dog took it all with a stoicism that was heartbreaking. Throughout the entire process, his eyes remained fixed on Jack. He needs to stay here for observation, she said finally, at least overnight. No, Jack said immediately. He comes with me. It wasn't a suggestion. He wasn't leaving his man behind. Anya started to argue, then stopped. She saw the ironclad resolve in his face. She also saw the way Kaiser, despite the pain and the strange environment, relaxed when Jack was near. They were already a unit. All right, she conceded, sighing. But you have to follow my instructions to the letter. Meds every 6 hours, small, frequent meals. And call me if anything changes, anything. She loaded him up with bags of specialized food, bottles of medication, and a list of instructions. She refused any payment. Consider it a professional courtesy, she said, with a small, sad smile. You take care of your people. Back at the farm, the dynamic had shifted. The house was no longer just a shell for his grief. It was a field hospital. It was a sanctuary. He settled Kaiser on the blankets by the fire and sat with him, watching the tranquilizer the vet had given him finally take hold. The dog's breathing evened out, the lines of pain on its face softened. For the first time since Jack had found him, Kaiser was at peace. Jack stayed awake, watching over him. He felt the old instincts stir, the familiar rhythm of standing watch. He was on guard duty. He had a charge to protect. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft, steady breathing of his newfound comrade. As dawn broke, painting the gray sky with pale streaks of pink and orange, Jack felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something close. It was the faint, fragile beginnings of hope. The next few days fell into a new routine. Meds, food, water, and quiet companionship. Kaiser slowly began to heal. The light returned to his eyes, and he started to put on weight. He would follow Jack from room to room, his cast making a soft thumping sound on the wooden floors. He never barked, never whined. He was a silent, watchful presence. a shadow that had attached itself to Jack's own. On the third night, Jack was sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle again, when Kaiser nudged his hand with his nose. Jack stopped. The dog looked at him, then nudged his hand again, more insistently. Jack put down the cleaning rod and tentatively rested his hand on the dog's head. Kaiser leaned into the touch, letting out a deep sigh of contentment. It was the first time either of them had initiated physical contact that wasn't born of necessity. A bridge had been crossed, but their fragile peace was not destined to last. Trouble, Jack knew, always came in waves. The first had been red, the second was about to make landfall. It started with a feeling, the same prickling on the back of his neck he used to get before an ambush. He was outside, replacing a rotted section of fence, with Kaiser lying in a patch of pale sunlight nearby. The air was still, too still. The birds had gone silent. Kaiser's head snapped up, his ears swiveling toward the woods. A low growl, different from the one he'd used before, rumbled in his chest. This wasn't a growl of pain or fear. This was a warning, a tactical alert. Jack scanned the tree line, his eyes automatically searching for what was out of place. A patch of shadow that was too dark, a shape that didn't belong. He saw it, a flicker of reflected light, a scope. Inside, he commanded in a low voice. Kaiser, inside, now. The dog, hearing the urgency in his tone, didn't hesitate. He limped quickly toward the farmhouse. Jack followed, moving in a low crouch, his mind racing. This wasn't some local thug. A scope meant professionals. They hadn't come to talk. He barely made it through the door before the first shot rang out, the sound a sharp crack like a distant sniper rifle. The round slammed into the doorframe where his head had been a second before, splintering the old wood. Contact front. The words echoed in his head, a ghost from his past. His body reacted before his mind could fully process it. He slammed the door shut, dropping the heavy bar across it. He was a fish in a barrel, a single farmhouse, no real fortifications, against an unknown number of hostiles. Another shot, this one shattering the window in the living room. Glass exploded inward. Kaiser was barking now, a deep, furious sound, standing his ground in the center of the room, facing the shattered window. He wasn't scared, he was angry, he was ready to fight. With me, Jack ordered, grabbing his rifle from its place against the wall. He chambered around, the sound a comforting, metallic snick. He moved toward the back of the house, keeping low. They would expect him to be pinned down in the front. He peered through a dirty pane in the back kitchen window. He saw two figures dressed in black tactical gear, moving with practiced ease along the tree line, attempting to flank the house. They moved like soldiers or mercenaries. He had no plates, no helmet, no team, just a hunting rifle, a single box of ammunition, and a three-legged dog. The odds were laughably bad. He felt a grim smile touch his lips. At least he wouldn't die of boredom. He knew the house, every creak, every loose floorboard. He knew the land, every ditch and hollow. This was his ground. He would make them pay for every inch. He moved to the old, crumbling barn. It was a death trap, but it offered more angles for cover than the house. Kaiser, heel, he commanded. The dog was at his side in an instant, a silent, loyal soldier. They slipped out the back door and made a mad dash across the 30 yards of open ground to the barn. A volley of suppressed shots kicked up dirt around their feet, the sound like angry hornets buzzing past. They dove through the wide open doors of the barn just as a full-throated burst of automatic fire chewed the wood where they had been. The barn was a cavern of shadows and dust. Light streamed through the gaps in the siding, creating a disorienting pattern of light and dark. It smelled of old hay and decay, a graveyard of forgotten things, a fitting place for a last stand. Jack took up a position behind a rusted-out tractor, resting his rifle on the hood. He could hear them moving outside, calling to each other in clipped, professional tones. They were setting up a perimeter, preparing to assault. One of them got careless. A figure in black stepped into the open doorway, silhouetted against the bright gray sky, rifle up. Jack didn't hesitate. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the man dropped without a sound. One down. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A hailstorm of bullets shredded the front of the barn, splintering wood, punching holes in the thin metal roof. Jack and Kaiser huddled behind the tractor, wood chips and dust raining down on them. They were professionals. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. They would use fire and movement. They would breach. He needed an equalizer. His eyes scanned the cluttered interior of the barn. Old gas cans for the tractor, a container of fertilizer, a tangle of rusty chains. His mind, trained for improvisation, started putting the pieces together. A new sound, the scraping of boots on the roof. They were coming from above. He grabbed a heavy chain, motioning for Kaiser to stay. He climbed the rickety ladder to the hayloft just as a boot smashed through a rotted section of the roof. He swung the chain with all his might. There was a satisfying crunch, a scream, and then the sound of a body sliding down the steep roof and hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Two down. He scrambled back down the ladder. He was running out of time. He could hear them preparing to breach the main doors. He looked at Kaiser, who was watching him, his amber eyes bright and alert, his body tensed like a coiled spring. On the dog's collar, amidst the dirt, was a small plastic tag Jack hadn't noticed before. It was cracked, but a tiny LED blinked faintly. An emergency beacon. Probably damaged, probably dead. But it was a chance. With a thumb that felt clumsy and slow, he pressed the recessed activation button. He held it down, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The light blinked once, twice, then went out. Nothing. Of course. A loud bang and the main doors of the barn shuddered. They were using a ram. He looked at Kaiser. "Well, buddy," he whispered. "Looks like this is it. It's been an honor." The dog just whined softly and licked his hand, as if to say, "We've got this." The doors burst open. Two men clad in black flooded in, rifles up, moving in a practiced V formation. They were fast, efficient, and deadly. Jack fired, dropping the man on the left. But the man on the right was already moving, laying down a burst of suppressive fire that pinned Jack behind the tractor. He was changing magazines, a split second of vulnerability. Suddenly, a black and tan blur shot out from behind the tractor. Kaiser, moving with impossible speed despite his cast, launched himself at the second man. He didn't go for the leg or the arm. He went for the throat, his MWD training taking over. The man screamed, a gurgled, choked sound, dropping his rifle as he tried to fend off the 70 pounds of furious, loyal dog latched onto him. That was the opening Jack needed. He rose from cover and put a single, precise round into the man's chest. Silence. The barn was still, the air thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Jack leaned against the tractor, his lungs heaving. His arm screamed where a piece of shrapnel from the doorframe had torn through his jacket. Kaiser let go of the dead man, limping back to Jack's side, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. He stood guard over his man, his partner. But Jack knew it wasn't over. There had been at least 5. He'd accounted for 4. Where was the last one? The leader. A voice called out from outside, calm and conversational. "Sergeant Riley, that's a former military working dog you have in there. K9 Unit Kaiser, asset number 734. He has stolen government property. So are you, in a way. A broken piece of equipment the government forgot it owned. Make it easy on yourself. Send out the dog and we'll let you walk away." Jack didn't answer. He knew a lie when he heard one. "No. A pity," the voice said. Then a new sound. The hiss of a gas canister. A thick white smoke began to pour through the gaps in the barn walls. Tear gas. His eyes burned, his lungs seized. He grabbed a greasy rag, soaked it in a puddle of stagnant water, and pressed it to his face. He did the same for Kaiser, who was whimpering, his sensitive nose overwhelmed. They were being flushed out. He was out of options, wounded, outgunned, and about to be incapacitated. He looked at Kaiser, who looked back at him with complete, unwavering trust. He had failed him. He had brought the war here, to this last peaceful place, and he had failed. And then he heard it. A sound that cut through the gas-induced haze. It started as a low, distant thrumming, growing steadily louder. A sound he knew better than his own heartbeat. The rhythmic whoomp 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 of Black Hawk helicopters. Not one, 2 of them. The mercenaries outside had heard it too. He heard panicked shouting, the sound of an engine starting. They were trying to bug out. Floodlights from above stabbed through the smoke, turning the barn into a surreal stage. Ropes dropped from the sky. Figures in full combat gear fast roped to the ground, forming a perimeter with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't a county sheriff's department. This was a Tier 1 response. The barn doors were kicked open again. This time, the man standing there was wearing a Marine Corps combat uniform, a colonel's eagle gleaming on his collar. He was flanked by 2 raiders in full kit. The man's face was hard, weathered, and familiar. Colonel Matthews, Jack breathed, the name a ragged whisper. Colonel Marcus Matthews, his former commanding officer, stepped into the barn. His eyes took in the scene, the dead mercenaries, the gas, the bleeding sergeant leaning on a tractor, and the 3-legged dog standing defiantly beside him. His hard expression softened with a deep, profound relief. "Sergeant Riley," the colonel said, his voice thick with emotion, "I see you found my dog." The world tilted on its axis. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and meaningless, suddenly slammed into place. Colonel Matthews knelt, ignoring the blood and the filth, and held out a hand to the German shepherd. "Hey, Kaiser, it's okay, boy. You're safe now." Kaiser looked at the colonel, then back at Jack, a low whine of confusion in his throat. Jack gave a slight nod. "It's okay." The dog limped forward and cautiously licked the colonel's hand. "That beacon on his collar," Matthews explained, his eyes on Jack. "It's a new prototype, short range, low power, but when it's activated, it sends a priority 1 alert directly to my desk. It pinged about 20 minutes ago. We were in the air for a training op 50 miles from here. The fastest response time in history, I imagine." He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the carnage. "We've been looking for him for 6 months, Jack, ever since he disappeared from the MWD kennels at Lejeune." The full story came out in a flood. Kaiser wasn't just any MWD, he was Sergeant David Ramirez's partner, Jack's best friend, the man whose laughter had been cut short by the IED that had nearly killed Jack. After Ramirez's death, Kaiser had been diagnosed with canine PTSD, grieving and refusing to work with another handler. A corrupt supply officer, a major we're currently prosecuting, wrote him off as surplus material and sold him to a broker who deals with private security firms, the colonel said, his voice laced with contempt. "Those men you killed, they weren't just mercenaries, they worked for a foreign intelligence service. They didn't just want the dog, Jack. Ramirez was working on a new type of signal intelligence program with Kaiser. They thought the dog's behavioral patterns, his reactions to certain commands, could be reverse engineered to crack our comms encryption." The weight of it all hit Jack like a physical blow. This whole time he thought he was just saving a stray. But he had been protecting a national asset. More than that, he was protecting the last living legacy of his best friend. The memory of Ramirez, a ghost that had haunted him for years, suddenly felt less like a specter and more like a presence, a guardian angel who had sent this dog to find him. A medic was working on Jack's arm, but he barely felt it. His eyes were on Kaiser, who was now being gently examined by a military vet who had arrived with the colonel. He saw the way the dog kept looking back at him, making sure he was still there. "What happens to him now?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. Colonel Matthews looked from Jack to the dog, and a deep understanding passed between the two men. "Officially, he's a highly classified asset that needs to be returned to a secure facility for debriefing and retirement. He's a hero. He deserves a peaceful retirement." He paused, his gaze intense. "But a dog like that, a dog like him, he needs a handler. He needs a purpose. He needs his pack." The unspoken offer hung in the air, heavier than the lingering tear gas. "His file says he only ever truly bonded with one man," the colonel continued softly. "Sergeant Ramirez. But I've been watching him for the last 10 minutes, and I think his file needs an update." Jack looked at Kaiser. The dog met his gaze, and in that moment, the bond that had been forged in pain and violence was sealed with a promise. They were 2 broken soldiers who, together, were somehow whole. They had saved each other. 1 year later, the sun rose over the ridges of West Virginia, casting a golden light on a farm that was no longer a corpse. The house was repaired, its windows clean. a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The fields were no longer choked with weeds, but were neatly fenced, home to a small agility course and a half dozen kennels. The sagging barn had been rebuilt, its new red paint a bold statement of renewal against the green landscape. A freshly painted sign hung over the gate. Ramirez Riley K. 9 Rehabilitation. For soldiers, by soldiers. Jack Riley stood on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands. The scars were still there, but they were no longer the whole story of his face. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady light. He was thicker in the chest and shoulders, the gauntness of his grief filled out by purpose and peace. His limp was barely noticeable now. Anya Sharma came out and stood beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The new pup is a natural," she said, her voice warm. "A little timid, but he wants to work." "They all do," Jack said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble. "They just need to be reminded how." He whistled, a single sharp note. From the barn, a magnificent German shepherd came bounding out, his coat a rich black and tan, his movements fluid and powerful. His leg was completely healed, a testament to Anya's skill and his own resilience. He ran to Jack, dropping a well-worn tennis ball at his feet before nudging his hand, the same gesture he had made that first night by the fire. "All right, you big mooch," Jack laughed, a sound that was now as much a part of the farm as the wind in the trees. He picked up the ball, his eyes meeting Kaiser's. In the dog's amber eyes, he no longer saw a reflection of his own pain. He saw loyalty, he saw family, he saw the unwavering spirit of his lost friend, David Ramirez, living on in this incredible creature. He saw home. He drew his arm back and threw the ball in a long, high arc across the green field. Kaiser launched after it, a joyful blur of motion, a soldier finally at peace, running free under the morning sun. Jack watched him, a genuine smile spreading across his face. He was a ghost no longer. He was a man who had been given a second chance, a new mission, a reason to walk in the light. And he was not walking alone.